Good morning, everybody. I can see there's people still joining us, but welcome. And I'm Steph from Simply Rhino, and I'd like to welcome you all to the 6th and, in fact, final webinar in our current Visualise with V-Ray for Rhino series. In today's webinar, we will look at jewellery visualization. The webinar should last approximately 30 minutes, and today we have two presenters. Firstly, Phil Cook, an experienced product design professional and Simply Rhino's senior trainer. And also, following Phil, we have Mark Segasby of Lightmap, the makers of HDR Light Studio. Jewellery rendering is essentially all about reflections and refractions, and Mark will demonstrate how HDR Light Studio makes it easy to fully control and place reflections precisely, merely by selecting the appropriate face on the model. Lighting, reflections and background can all be controlled with the V-Ray Dome light and the out-of-the-box support for the HDR Light Studio Live. As usual, today's webinar is being recorded, so you can watch it again. It will be posted on our YouTube channel, and a link to that is available on our dedicated webinar page on the Simply Rhino website. As we progress through the presentation, please do type any questions you may have and send to us. It's likely that we will answer these questions in our official Q&A session at the end of the presentation. I'd like to say a quick thank you to Chaos Group, Scan Computers and PMY for their assistance, and of course to Mark from Lightmap for co-presenting today. That's all for me for now. I'm going to hand over to Phil for the beginning of the presentation. Phil, over to you, please.
Thank you. Morning, everybody. Hi, I'm Phil from Simply Rhino. And before we look at HDR Light Studio, I just wanted to go through a few of the basics of V-Ray for Rhino just with image-based lighting, and then try and explain why HDR Light Studio improves things dramatically for creating image-based lighting on the fly. So here we have a basic scene, and just to recap, V-Ray has two rendering engines. We have V-Ray RT, which we can either use in viewport or as a floating window, and then we have the production renderer. V-Ray RT is a render which continually renders. It's a progressive path ray tracer, so the rendering engine is continually rendering in front of us, and updates as we move the scene around, and you'll see that it calculates the glossy calculations much quicker than the blurry materials, in line with what most renderers do. This is a scene which is set up with the default settings in V-Ray 2.0, and by default now, if we look in the environment map, in the environment channel here, we have an image loaded in to both the skylight and the reflection channels. This is the kind of traditional way of image-based lighting, using an environment to control the lighting and the background. And the issue with using environmental lighting like this is that technically this is only indirect illumination, so we don't get very strong contact shadows, and also we need to turn up the quality settings in V-Ray to smooth out the noise. So as we've mentioned in earlier webinars, we have a great light now in V-Ray which is called the dome light, which we see as a kind of a metaphor of a dome here, and we can then load in a dome texture, an image, onto our or into our dome in a very similar metaphor to loading an image into the skylight. So I'm going to choose a fairly sort of abstracted studio image here for this. It's just something like this we'll do here. And remember that when we load in a spherical map here into the environment in V-Ray, we need to switch to UVW environment here. And we need to make sure the mapping type here matches the projection of the image. And then we have a multiplier here that we can use to increase the brightness of the light. And you can see now that this scene is starting to be illuminated fairly well. I'm just going to switch now to the production renderer because we'll probably be able to just compare things a little easier in the production renderer. So here's a straightforward image just with the dome light, and you can start to see here that we're getting much better shadows immediately. One of the things about the dome light here is that by default you will see the image that we're using to light with in the background. So effectively we see the inside of the dome, using exactly the same metaphor as we do in the Environment tab. So if I was to select the dome light and make this invisible, then we'd see our environmental image in the background. And if I wanted to do this also with a ground plane that still captures some shadows, then I can select this material here, and for V-Ray Express I can use the wrapper material, which is a matte shadow material or a shadow catcher. So if we do a small comparison render here, you'll see now that we see the background, and then we see our shadow catcher material underneath. Okay, so next up I wanted to look at a new feature that's been put into 2.0, which is called Dispersion. Okay, so Dispersion allows us to see the separate colors that are created in clear or transparent or translucent objects. And there are some materials that are set up by default here. I'm just going to actually revert the ground plane to just a more basic color here. This may just help us see what's going on in the scene here. And I'm going to pick this diamond at the front, and I'm going to choose this material here from V-Ray Express, which is called Diamond with Dispersion. And let's bring up the frame buffer here, and again let's render the same area, and you'll immediately see some colors now in the indirect illumination pre-passes, and these actually resolve themselves fairly subtly in the diamond here. You can see we've got really nice little areas of color going on inside of here. So this is dispersion, and in the actual material itself, this is controlled in the refraction layer here. Dispersion is just a checkbox, and then we use an AB value here to control the amount of dispersion. Now this is a physically correct feature, and you can see if you Google AB values, you can find physically correct values for common materials. So you can see here that we're seeing little bits of color going on in the diamond. So one of the issues with image-based lighting is that if I want to change and move reflections on here, then I have to really move the image that's inside of the dome light. It's not the case that I can actually pick the dome light and rotate it. The image map needs to be moved independently of the dome light. So for example, we might do this by going into the dome texture here and rotating the image. And this is one of the things that HDR Light Studio improves tremendously, which we'll see in a moment, where we can actually see next to the V-Ray window, we can see the image that's actually producing the map, and it's very easy to to change. Just one other thing I just want to very quickly mention before I hand over is that the nice thing about the dome light is that it's a fairly simple proposition here. So if I wanted to actually start to clean out noise from the dome light here, then all I need to do is to increase the subdivisions from the default 8 to something like 32, and then you'll see that the noise in the shadows here is pretty much removed. So if I just uncheck the little region buffer here and zoom in, you can see here we see the noise, here we see nice smooth shadows. So the dome light is a very, very simple light to use, and what makes it even more exciting to use for product designers, jewellery designers, automotive designers especially, is HDR Light Studio. So with that, I'll hand you over to Mark, and he can show you around HDR Light Studio.
Brilliant. Thanks, Phil. So I'm now going to change over and hand over to Mark.
Hi everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen now. Excellent. So continuing on from where we've been talking with Phil, I've also got a jewellery scene here. So I'm going to show you how you can light this with HDR Light Studio, building on what you've just been shown by Phil. So I'm going to use V-Ray RT quite a lot because it's really useful for getting the live interactive feedback. So if I just start up the V-Ray RT view, and you'll see that this scene is very dark, and that's to be expected because there's no lighting in it at all. So I'm going to light this scene just with one dome light. So I'm going to create my dome light, and that's just got some default lighting on there. And I'll go over to properties and go to my light properties, and V-Ray for Rhino 2 includes this section here for starting and controlling HDR Light Studio version 4. So if you have HDR Light Studio 4 loaded on your computer, V-Ray detects it and it just creates this panel and you're good to go. It's that simple. So let's start HDR Light Studio. Now instantly the lighting has changed in this view because now HDR Light Studio is connected live with Rhino and V-Ray. So if I was to load a HDRI map into the background in HDR Light Studio, now this is lighting my scene. And as Phil was talking about, you're probably quite familiar with loading maps and twisting them and doing test renders and kind of guessing where can I twist this to make the lighting look quite good. And sometimes you can find some very nice lighting by just using this kind of trial and error method. So I think the thing is, if you're a professional photographer and you were going to light some jewellery and you took a photograph of it on a desk in your studio, it would look very much like this. It wouldn't look very professional. It would look quite realistic, but it wouldn't look like a professional photograph. And that's because if you're making images of jewellery, when a professional photographer would light this, he really wants to control the reflections within these items to kind of bring out the shape and the form in the gold and the silver, and to make these gemstones twinkle a bit. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to use this HDRI here as a base. At the moment it's got some colour in there and I don't want that colour to pollute my shot, so I'm actually going to colour this HDRI map with white, which will actually make it grayscale, and I'm going to turn down the brightness a bit so that we kind of use this map as like a base of realism for the shot, but then we're going to add extra lighting. So just a little tour of HDR Light Studio. This here essentially is your HDRI map, and anything you see on this canvas view is being pushed straight into your V-Ray for the lighting. So in terms of what kind of lights can we add to the HDRI map, we can add synthetic lights, which are mathematically created, and we can change the size of these lights, we can change their colour, and as we click around on this map, that light is distorted to map perfectly to the dome. So if our light is here, it's a circle, and if it's at the top of the map, once this is mapped onto the sphere, it will also be a circle. So if you were to try and make your own lighting in Photoshop, you'd find everything that was at the top of the map would get squeezed up and it wouldn't look right at all. And that's really what we handle in real time in HDR Light Studio. So we have these synthetic lights. I'll come back to these later. Here, as we make lights, you can see them all in the list here, and you can show and hide them or delete them. Now, a really useful type of light is what we call picture lights. Some of these are interesting lighting effects, like say rows of spotlights, and then some are photographs of real studio lighting. Now these can be very good for jewellery because they create a lot of realism, and I'm going to choose one of these, which is the side of a light tent. It's got a nice little highlight going on here and a nice shape, so I'm going to select that, and I can kind of try and move this around and guess where to put it, but that's not really a very good process. So here's where there's a really nice feature for positioning lights in HDR Light Studio. So you'll see in this control panel we can show, hide HDR Light Studio, and then there's a tick box here called Light Paint. What this does is if I turn that on, it will use this mode to place the light. So if it's in reflection mode, if I was to click on a model, which I'm going to do now, I'll click here on the ring, and I have this light selected, you'll see in this render that that light has jumped immediately to the right place to reflect in that part of the model. Now in terms of lighting jewellery, you really will only ever need to use this reflection mode. So I'll leave that turned on, and you can see here we've got this lovely nice reflection, and I'm just going to make that larger, scale that up. Okay, and what I want is actually I want another nice reflection over here, so I will simply duplicate my light, and then my light paint is still on, and I'll just click here on the model, and that's not quite in the right place, so I can just move that along until it looks good. Now very often on kind of jewellery rendering you will see you have something like this kind of white light, and then you have like black lines around them, and this is usually from a softbox, and you can replicate that in HDR Light Studio. So I'm going to duplicate this light so it's in exactly the same place. I'm going to get this one that's behind it, I'm going to make that totally black, and then I can scale that up, and I get like my black border to the light, which makes it look really realistic, like a kind of studio lighting. And I'll duplicate that and put that on there. Now you see I've duplicated it, and this light is at the top of the list. If I drag that to the bottom, it will be underneath this light, and I'll get that nice kind of studio style lighting effect on my ring there. Now if I look on the ring over here, then it's not quite as pleasing. So what I might do is just fiddle with the scale of my light just to see if I can get the look on this ring looking nice as well. And scale that over there, and then scale that one. And for some of these things there is going to be a bit of trial and error. There we go. And then we just turn down the brightness of one of these, and you get that nice kind of a little bit of differentiation between those. So we've got some nice soft boxes reflecting in there, and if you wanted to control the brightness across here, we could control that with a gradient. So here, instead of colorizing this light, which you can do, I'm going to use a gradient, and it's going to be white at one end, and I'm going to make that a bit darker at the other end. And then I could actually control how the light falls off across there. So I'll do that, so it gives it a nice kind of fall-off effect, and then I'll just make it a little bit brighter. Okay. Now, here we have this brightness control. This doesn't actually change the data we're sending for the lighting, but it's your view onto this data, because this image is high dynamic range. And so if I turn this down a bit, what this means is I could say add another one of my synthetic lights on top here, and it layers up, and it gives me the ability to kind of boost the lighting. So if you see just in this corner here, I've kind of boosted the lighting along there, and I could place another one over here. I could make that a bit narrower and put that on there and do a bit of a boost of lighting on there. So you can actually layer up these lighting effects to get quite sophisticated maps. Okay, so let's just look at this shot. What are we missing? Well, I think the top here is looking a bit dull, and we need to get some lights in there. And I'm going to make some small synthetic lights. So here's a synthetic light, and instead of it being too perfect, I'm actually going to just use this ramp to just make the appearance of that almost like an IES light source. Okay, so we've just got a little bit of variation in that. I'm going to make it quite bright. I'm going to make it quite small to start with, and then let's place that in this kind of dull area on the ring. So light paint is still working. Let's click on there, and we've just added that highlight, and I'm just going to move that a bit. Okay, and then I'm going to brighten that up, so we're giving it a real bit of zing on that part of the ring. And I'll simply duplicate that, because I'd like to put one at the back here. And I just kind of look at my shot, and I think it might be nice to put a couple to make the gemstones come alive. So I will duplicate that, make it a bit smaller, and click on my gemstones. See, that one's already over a light, so we don't need one there. There's one there. Duplicate this. Let's say one over there. Oops, I actually clicked on my render. That's it, and there's a bit of twinkle there. Okay, so you've seen how easily I can precisely light the jewellery, and I could get the reflections exactly where I want them using my interactive HDR map. And you've seen how the lights are layered up in the light list, and you can change the order to change how they're layered. And we have synthetic lights, we have picture lights, we can load HDRI maps into the background and colour them. We could have just had a gradient in the background, so we don't even need a HDR as a base at all. But I quite like the little interesting bits of detail that can add to the shot. So I'll close that. The final thing I'm going to show you is you can use these lights to layer colour effects. So if I have the lighting design and I'm happy with it, I might want to kind of make the lighting a little bit blue from one side. And if I, say, use colour temperature to pick a slightly blue colour, I could scale that light up, and then I could change the blend mode for that light to colour. And then all that will do is anything that light is over, it will slightly colour it, and I can increase or decrease how much that's colouring. And it can just add a little bit more three-dimensionality to your shot, so it's not purely clean white lighting. So, okay, let's say I'm happy with this. How do we finish this process? Well, what we do is we press the Render Close button. What this does is I can just save a HDRI map on my computer, and if I render that, what this will do is it should close HDR Light Studio, and then it will actually assign that HDRI map that we just made onto our dome light. So if I look at the texture here, and you'll see there it is. So I could now save this scene. I could give it to, say, anybody else in the studio. They would be able to render it because now it's just pointing at a normal HDR map. It's totally standard. The really great thing is if I come back to this scene and I think, I'd want to make a few changes to that lighting. If I show HDR Light Studio again, then all of that lighting design has been embedded in my Rhino scene. So I've always got that original scene, and I can totally go back and see each individual light that made it up. I can isolate particular lights, see what their effect is, and make changes. So all that information is there. It's not like I lost it when I saved the HDR file. So really, that's how HDR Light Studio can help you light shots in Rhino, particularly jewellery. And I'll just end my presentation. I'll just close that and just show you that we've got a lot of customers produce some really stunning work using HDR Light Studio. And here's just some examples of what people have done. And you can see that for jewellery, really, you look at the object and all you actually are seeing a lot of the time is that environment around the object, and it is those reflections which are communicating the form. So having control over those is really essential to getting beautiful shots out of V-Ray. And we don't just light jewellery. We're really useful for all kind of product shots where you really want to control the lighting and reflections. And we use for cars, products, even quite creative shots in the VFX industry. So really, I'd like to finish by saying thanks very much for attending this webinar and taking the time to have a look at this. And that's the end of my presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. We've had some questions come through, and so I'm going to go to Phil. And
Yep.
Phil, I forwarded you the questions, so if I can leave it for you and Mark to go over that.
Okay. Well, the first question here is, can you load a regular image into HDR Light Studio, JPEG, for example? So Mark will be able to tell you whether you can or cannot load it, but let me just explain that an HDR image is essentially, it's a high dynamic range image. So what that means is if you think of a normal JPEG image of having brightness values between black and white ranging from black being 0, white being 1, then HDR images basically have brightness values over 1. So you can have really strong lighting contained inside of the HDR image. The V-Ray dome light sees the bright spots on the HDR and it actually treats those as proper direct illumination. So irrespective of whether you could load an ordinary image into HDR Light Studio, I think that you wouldn't get the benefit that you would do from a true HDR image. Do you have anything else to add to that, Mark? Is that?
I think, yeah, I mean, yeah, totally right. And I think if you did want to use a low dynamic range image as a base for your lighting, you could save, you could open a JPEG in Photoshop and save it as an EXR file or a HDR file. And as long as the ratio was 2:1 and you loaded that into HDR Light Studio 4 as a background, then that would provide a base. So let's say you're into doing panoramic photography, but you don't want to go to the effort of doing HDR panoramas, which take a lot longer. You might find you grab something on your iPhone or something and you have a panorama. You can load, if you save it as an EXR or HDR, you can load it in, and then you can add lighting to it, and say if you had the sun on there, the sun would not be bright enough, but you could actually add a sun and make it the right brightness using HDR Light Studio.
Great. Okay. Next question here is where can I get HDR Light Studio? Well, you can, and there's a subsidiary question here as well from another attendee, which so basically you can get HDR Light Studio from Simply Rhino, and we'd be very pleased to hear from you should you wish to inquire about it. And the subsidiary question here from another user is, if I want to use HDR Light Studio with V-Ray for Rhino, which product is it? It's a. Can you explain how your products are broken down, Mark, into different areas?
Absolutely. There's basically, we created a special edition of HDR Light Studio that works only with V-Ray for Rhino at a bit of a cheaper price than the full-blown version of HDR Light Studio. So HDR Light Studio for V-Ray for Rhino, that's the product that you should buy if you only want to use it with V-Ray for Rhino and do everything that I've shown you today. If you want to use HDR Light Studio with other rendering products that you may have, then we have an edition called HDR Light Studio Complete, and basically that supports anything that's listed on our website in terms of compatibility. So you would be able to use that with other packages like Maxwell Studio, and they're all on our website. So we support a lot of packages that we can connect to live. So that would be HDR Light Studio Complete. And then if there was a big team of you, we do floating versions of HDR Light Studio, and a floating seat is the complete spec. So you could buy, a couple of seats, and 30 people could kind of, as long as there's only 2 being used at the same time, 30 people could get access to that software in any of their rendering packages. So that's the product lineup.
Great. Okay. So yeah, we had another couple of subsidiary questions here. Does it support Maxwell in Rhino too? So clearly that's the sort of overall product there that would
yeah. So you can't use HDR Light Studio inside Rhino with anything else other than with V-Ray. If you wanted to use HDR Light Studio with Maxwell, you'd use Maxwell Studio, which we work with, but we won't work live with Maxwell with Rhino. The other thing to point out is HDR Light Studio works fully standalone and has its own lighting preview renderer. So as long as you can create a Collada file or an OBJ file, you can actually load those in, and we act as a standalone tool. And at the end of the process, you have a HDRI map that you can use in any rendering software at all. So again, if you wanted our own little lighting preview renderer called Live Light, that comes in the complete version.
Excellent. Okay. Just one other question here, Mark, is about lighting interiors. Saying it's mainly product shots on your website. Any value in using HDR Light Studio for interiors?
We get asked this quite a lot, because a lot of the examples that we show are kind of objects, so a car, a product, a phone, whatever. Really, if you think about what could I use HDR Light Studio for, all you need to kind of answer is, could I light this with a normal HDRI? Would I light this with a HDRI? If you couldn't, then we probably won't be that applicable. So if you had an interior and you had one window and you put a HDRI on the outside of it, then that room can only see a little part of that HDRI to get a bit of light into the room, and you won't be able to kind of put lights in 3D space within that room, because all the lighting is coming from the HDRI, which is outside. We do have customers who have used us for interiors, but it's been more like kind of bathrooms and kitchens where they leave 2 of the walls missing and they have the ceiling missing, so it's more like a pretend interior, like a set. And then if you do that, then you've got kind of half of the environment can be seen, half the HDR can be seen by the stuff inside the room, and then it can be quite useful. But an enclosed interior, HDRI maps are not the way to light them.
Yes, I think we covered interiors in the last webinar, and certainly now with the new features in the V-Ray physical sun and sky system now, being able to control horizontal illumination makes it pretty easy actually to get a good base level of lighting in an interior now using sun and sky. So if anybody wants to go back and take a look at that webinar, they have been recorded and they're on our website. So just finally, and Steph or Mark may be able to answer this one. Stephen Booth is just who I think looks like he knows you, Mark, because it says
hi.
It's just wondering how much is HDR Light Studio?
It's just way too cheap. It's okay. The V-Ray for Rhino edition is £195, and the complete edition is £299.
Perfect.
Thanks,
okay,
Steve.
Steph. I think that's.
Okay, that's all the questions I think covered there. Brilliant, thanks everybody. If anyone has got any further questions arising from today's presentation, then just drop me a line and one of us will get back to you. And just to say thank you to everyone for joining us, and we'll be scheduling some new webinars soon, some new series, and we'll be updating details on those on our website, and hopefully we'll see everyone at one of those in the future. So let's sign off, and thank you everybody very much. Cheers. Bye-bye.